Hello everybody, this is our final lecture here, chapter 49, an introduction to ecology. So this is a short chapter to close out the course. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope you, were able to at least get something out of the online version of the class and can take it with you in future courses that you will take going forward. So, very brief introduction to ecology, short kind of final chapter here. So we're going to look at how ecology really ties together the themes that we've been discussing all throughout the course. So plants, animals, diversity, fungi, all of that will kind of tie together with how plants and animals interact with each other, with the environment, with the living factors, with the non-living factors, right? And how we study them at the ecological level, the population level, ecosystem, community, and all of that. So what is ecology? So ecology is a study of how organisms interact with their environment. So ecology is really all about interactions. Okay, we want to understand the distribution, so where organisms are, how many of them there are, how they, manage the use of resources within their own populations of species, how they interact with neighboring species in a community, right? And, how they interact with humans, and the impact of humans on ecosystem stability and diversity. So ecology really does nicely tie in many subdivisions of biology, and we can see those effects when we study ecology as a whole and all of the different subdivisions of it. So to understand what it is that we're studying in ecology, biologists can look at ecology and we can look and see what we're studying at 5 different levels. So you can study in ecology one single organism, so one bird or one tree. Or you can look at a population, you can look at all the trees of a certain species, all the cardinals. You can look at the community, you can look at how the trees interact with the cardinals, interact with the grasses, interact with the worms. It's all the living factors and how they interact. If we're studying the ecosystem level, we're studying how all of those living factors interact with the non-living factors as well. Things like climate, air temperature, salinity, pH, how those influence how the organisms live. We could also study ecosystems at a very large scale. We can look at them at biomes, right, which are ecosystems that span large areas, like the grasslands biome or the deciduous forest biome. We look at the entire Earth's ecosystem, the biosphere itself, and study global patterns and how they're influencing different organisms. So various ways we can look at how organisms interact. So specifically, organismal ecology, we're going to be looking at, how one organism lives in a particular area. So that's where we've spent a lot of time this term looking at organismal ecology, looking at anatomy and physiology of how different animals live in their different systems. Organismal ecologists ask questions about how individuals interact with their physical surroundings and with other organisms in their habitat. A population is a group of individuals that live in the same area at the same time. Same species is the key thing there about a population. If you're looking at population ecology, you're really looking at numbers of individuals in a population changing over time. So you look and see, okay, what was the population of white-tailed deer in a certain area over time, right? Did it increase and decrease, and what factors could have led to those increases and decreases? So we look at the human population as it undergoes exponential growth, okay, right? And we look and see, okay, what's happening to the resources of the earth as the human population increases? Okay, so population is just one species, and it's important to look at just one species, as that does influence various factors in an ecosystem. Community ecology is studying how different species interact with one another. And so we look at the interactions that exist between predators, prey, parasites, hosts, competition for resources. We look at all kinds of symbiotic relationships in here, how different groups of species basically distribute their habitats into different niches, and they can look and see, okay, how can all of these different species occupy one tree? All these different species of birds, let's say, occupy one tree. Okay, it's because they partition themselves to essentially have different needs, and they can all coexist in the same area because they occupy different niches or different needs. The ecosystem level is studying all of the organisms and also the abiotic or the non-living components, so things like nutrients, energy, sunlight, atmosphere, soil, water temperature, and all the factors associated with those things, the dissolved oxygen in the water, would all be examples of things that would be studied at the ecosystem level. And this provides very valuable information into the health of the animals, the plants, the microorganisms that live in that ecosystem by studying not only how they interact with the living factors, but also how they interact with the non-living factors. All right, so they play a very critical role in understanding ecosystem stability and ecosystem diversity, and looking at various factors in which we can preserve ecosystems. The biosphere is how we study global ecology, so a thin zone surrounding Earth where all life exists. So studying the biosphere is a young but rapidly growing field, and the major focus here is how humans impact Earth's global ecosystem, right? So what are things that we are doing to affect change in ecosystems? Things like carbon emissions, global climate change, ocean acidification. All of these things affect the global ecosystem, and there's lots of implications for this economically, politically, right? Studying global ecology, but a very interesting field to look at when it comes to examining the needs of our planet. So here are some different examples. Again, you can study this figure looking at the 5 levels of global ecology, the 5 levels of ecological study: ecosystem, organismal ecology, population, community, ecosystem, and global ecology, right? So good figure here, summarizing what we just talked about. Conservation biology is a really interesting field and applies to all levels of ecological study. Basically, when we look at conservation biology, we're looking to study, preserve, restore threatened populations, community, and ecosystems. So recognizing the needs of endangered organisms and protecting these ecological hotspots is really critical to conservation biologists, right? So keeping these things that are rapidly declining from reaching extinction is the job of conservation biologists. So again, a very interesting field. So one of the things conservation biologists study is the distribution and abundance of organisms. So specifically the study of that is biogeography. And the biogeography is the study of how organisms are distributed geographically, and we can look at how the interactions between the abiotic and biotic environments affect where a particular species lives and their ultimate biogeography. We can look to preserve and protect these areas that are very high in biodiversity based on their biogeography. So I mentioned some of this already, but abiotic factors play a key role in ecosystem sustainability. So a fundamental observation about the range or geographic distribution of organisms is that no species lives everywhere on Earth. So there's specific organisms that live in specific areas. So the suite of conditions that a species can tolerate is its niche or its role in the environment. So you can say that, an organism lives in a tree, but its niche is eating a specific food in one part of the tree. Okay, so the niche can really describe all the characteristics that make an organism unique from another organism and allow it to survive in its habitat. Niche models can be used to help simplify complicated relationships, and we can look and see how niches are partitioned in an ecosystem. These abiotic factors, though, only explain part of species distribution. So when we say abiotic factors, we're talking about, the climate conditions and all of that, but there's also various other factors as well that influence where a species is going to live. Things like mating patterns will also influence that, and those are not abiotic factors. So in this figure, what we're looking at is the proportion of individuals and the average temperatures in which we find them. So the Arctic microbe, most of the Arctic microbes are living just under 0 degrees Celsius. That's where they are well adapted. That's where we find the abundance of them. Whereas these, and you can see though that they have a wide range of tolerance. So we see these cold adapted microbes from minus 20 all the way up to 20, even though the majority of them are around 0. So this is probably their ideal condition, but we find them living at a wider range of spaces. Okay, so they can tolerate a wide range of temperatures, whereas these hot springs microbes, look at how much smaller their range is. So, 50 degrees Celsius to 80. Okay, so a much sharper divide here, where almost all of them need to be at that 70-degree range. So not as much tolerance there for temperature in the hot springs microbes compared to the Arctic microbes, which are better adapted to more range of temperatures. So I mentioned so that's an example of how an abiotic factor limits a niche for a species. A biotic factor, though, can also limit niches. So things like competition for resources, for foods, is going to limit where a species can be, right? If there's no food, then they can't live there. Reproductive requirements, okay, mating rituals, parasitism, these things will also affect the distribution of a species. Okay, so the tsetse fly, major problem in Africa, and you can see the areas where they are distributed, okay? And you can see the areas where the cattle is distributed. And you'll see that there's very little overlap because the tsetse fly and the cattle do not interact as parasite-host relationships. So we're going to see that these remaining separated and thriving in separate regions. Tsetse fly also has major implications on humans as well, as an example. But the influence of humans also on biodiversity and species distributions is evident. So your book talks about Wallace, who studied distributions of species that were not affected by modern human dispersal. So humans have influenced species for thousands of years by hunting, farming, physically moving species. So we've taken species either advertently or inadvertently and moved them from one place to another, and that has extreme implications on the area, because now we can introduce species to an area where they're unknown and they can wreak havoc if they have no predators. Okay, they can totally wipe out an ecosystem. So there's two types of species that we can talk about here that are non-native. So exotic and invasive species. So exotic species can be introduced to a new area. Okay, so it can be non-native. If it causes lots of problems and eliminates native species, we call it an invasive species. So in North America, most things that we see, a lot of them are invasive, unfortunately. So the kudzu, the African honeybees, the Argentine ants, zebra mussels, these things are all invasive species, and they've taken over the ecosystems to which they were introduced and wiped out the native species from that area, which is not a good thing. Okay, we want to keep native species where they are because they can be only in that area, and if they're wiped out, then they can become extinct. So these invasive species are a major, major problem across the globe. The distribution and abundance of species are often determined by an interaction of both these biotic factors and abiotic factors that we've talked about. So there's different ecological models that can be used to predict the consequences of these interactions, but they must rely on some direct measures. So we can look at models, and they provide some predictability, but we need to go out and we need to really measure and look at this stuff firsthand to get the best idea of how species are influenced across the board. Okay. And this last slide here is just showing some examples of the aquatic biomes. I'm not going to really go through all of these. You can read this and take a look at it. There is an activity that you're going to do in your mastering that will take you through the different types of aquatic biomes. And biomes are just large ecosystems, specifically in the ocean. All right, so that wraps up the course. Make sure that you complete the homework assignments for this week. The discussion question this week is just a reflection on your learning. What your favorite thing you learned was. Make sure you reply to a classmate, get a little conversation going, and complete Exam 4. Now, Exam 4 is the last exam of the course. It'll be open, I believe, Monday and Tuesday. So the class, week 7 ends Sunday night, and then Monday and Tuesday your exam will be open. It's the same as your other exams. It's not a final exam. It's just on the chapters covered since Exam 3. All right, and then that will wrap things up. And your final course grades will be available shortly thereafter. I don't do any extra credit, any rounding. anything like that. So please do not waste your time and mine by asking. All right? So I will talk to you soon. Maybe I'll see you around. If not, best of luck with your upcoming fall semester. And, wherever you may be, online or at home, or online or on campus, I wish you the best of luck.